Traveled a long distance to be with us today, so I'm very grateful that the weather gods gave him a beautiful evening last night and tonight, and a safe passage across the country from Oregon. As your program tells you, I don't have my glasses on, so I hope I can do this justice. Forgive me if I make a mistake. Dr. Wonham is from the University of Oregon. He did his undergraduate work at Princeton and then at the University of Virginia. And over dinner tonight, he shared with me the fact that his doctoral dissertation, he had a publisher for it known actually before he entered the room to defend his dissertation. So that speaks to the quality of his early work and his continued work. He's got a pretty long resume of published articles and some books, and now he is also the chairman of the Department of English. And we are delighted to have him here for what I'm sure it will be an interesting and maybe at least halfway fun talk, at least aside about play. So I turn the time over to Dr. Henry Wonham from the University of Oregon.
Thanks, Barb. Before I begin, I just wanted to express my condolences over the tragic death of Michael Kiskis. I know this must be just a devastating blow for the Elmira College community, as it is for the Mark Twain community, of which Michael was a really very, very important part. I wish I could be here on, I guess, Saturday for his memorial service, but unfortunately I won't be able to, so I'll be here in spirit. I'd like to thank Barbara for inviting me and the Center for Mark Twain Studies for making this talk possible. I have come all the way from Eugene, Oregon to be here, and it has been a thrill so far. I had a fantastic day today. Walks in the woods, reading in the library, nothing to do, no one to bother me. I have 3 kids, actually 2 kids at home at the moment, and lots of baseball games to drive to, and dogs to walk, and other kinds of responsibilities. And so actually I think I would have had a fantastic day at the Motel 6 down the road if I'd had 24 hours with absolutely nothing to do but to enjoy myself. So thank you, Barbara, for making this possible. Of course, it's customary to begin a lecture by thanking one's hosts, but I have an even better reason for expressing my appreciation. And that is that this talk was really inspired by Quarry Farm and by my sense of what this place must have meant to Mark Twain. I'm certainly not an Elmira historian, I know there are some, or an expert on the Langdon family, I know there are some of those too. But as I tried to think through questions about the nature of work and play in Twain's writing, I found myself continually returning to a paradox that Twain himself associated with this place, namely, that Quarry Farm was the site of his annual summer-long vacation from the tremendously demanding work of being Mark Twain, and that it was simultaneously his most productive workplace. To put the matter much too simply, work and play, labor and leisure, occupation and avocation felt like interchangeable and indistinguishable categories during those highly productive summer days he spent sequestered in the octagonal study Susan Crane had built for him in 1874, which he called a cozy nest perched near heaven, far from the insect interests and occupations of the distant earth. It was at this extreme remove from the very idea of occupation that for 25 years Mark Twain did his best work, because it was here that work could seem indistinguishable from play. I'll be the first to admit that this paradox seems a little bit contrived. Isn't the work of any creative writer necessarily a kind of play? And aren't these terms, perhaps for white-collar workers generally, always in some sense misnomers? Hank Morgan expresses this suspicion in A Connecticut Yankee when he insists that intellectual work is misnamed. It is a pleasure, a dissipation, and its own highest reward. Personal misgivings of this sort about the very nature of work, including the sort of work I'm now doing, and for which I am happy to be paid as a scholar, gave rise to this talk, and I don't pretend to have resolved them fully. What I can say with conviction, though, is that the twinned concepts of work and play fascinated Mark Twain throughout his life, and that far more than semantics are involved in sorting out their relationship in his life and in his fiction. Reflecting on the best job he ever held, Twain wrote in his autobiography that piloting on the Mississippi River was not work to me. It was play. Delightful play. Vigorous play. Adventurous play. It seems that this conflation of concepts was as essential to Twain's notion of human happiness as it was to his understanding of literary creativity, which also required a blending of categories. Writing from this very spot to Mary Fairbanks in August of 1877, perhaps after one of those long and productive days in the study, he said that the luckiest writers were those confined to a prison cell, like Sir Walter Raleigh and Cervantes, both of whom wrote major works from behind bars. Solitary imprisonment by compulsion, he wrote, is the one perfect condition for perfect performance. For then the writer's work becomes his pleasure, his recreation, his absorption, his uplifting and all-satisfying enthusiasm. I believe that the octagonal study at Quarry Farm was Mark Twain's fortunate prison, in that it fostered the coincidence of work and play, or labor and recreation, as no other place in his experience ever did, except perhaps the pilot house of a Mississippi steamboat. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that as he sat in his study, engaged in a form of work that was simultaneously a form of play, he was inspired to create fictional worlds like St. Petersburg, where a character named Tom Sawyer manages to transform the labor of whitewashing into a children's game. Perhaps now you can imagine where the idea for this lecture came from and where I propose to take it this evening. The image of Mark Twain seated at his writing desk here at the farm, engaged in a kind of work that he understands as play, composing, among so many other things, the story of a boy who transforms work into play, strikes me as an image worth thinking about. To begin that analysis, I first want to explore the meaning of work and play in the lives of Twain's contemporaries, Americans of the late 19th century, for whom these terms were fraught with ominous significance. I'd then like to spend a few minutes considering representations of work and play in Twain's two first books of travel, The Innocents Abroad and Roughing It. The second of these books carries special significance for my theme, because Twain was lugging the long overdue and woefully incomplete manuscript of Roughing It with him in March 1871, when he and Livy arrived for their first summer together here in Elmira, where he said that he planned to get clear away from all hamperings, all harassments, and shut myself up in a farmhouse alone and write. And he did write here at the farm for 3.5 tremendously prolific months, rattling off as many as 200 manuscript pages a week, and experiencing, perhaps for the first time in his writing career, that fascinating sensation that he often described of effortless productivity, of literary work that is both a pleasure and a dissipation. Roughing It is a pivotal text for thinking about these issues, but it is in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Twain's first novel, and the first of his books to take shape largely in the newly constructed study itself, that they received their classic treatment. And I'll close with a reading of Twain's iconic whitewashing scene, a reading that Norman Rockwell or Walt Disney might not approve of, for Tom's mastery of the work-play relationship, as I read it, raises more questions than it answers. But more on Tom Sawyer in a few minutes. Toward the very end of Mark Twain's life, after Livy's death and after the last of those summers of playful productivity in Elmira, he declared in an interview, "What work I have done because it was play. If it had been work, I wouldn't have done it." This was one of his favorite exaggerations, for among American writers there was never a harder worker. And his well-documented struggles with the composition of books like Huckleberry Finn, which took 8 years to complete, suggest that work and play were not always so neatly aligned, either for Twain as a working writer, or within the worlds of his his fiction and travel writing. Moreover, for most Americans of his generation, the prevailing impression was that work and play, labor and recreation were becoming increasingly divergent categories. It's a mistake to romanticize about life in pre-industrial America, but cultural historian William Gleason is probably right that until the middle of the 19th century, most work in the United States remained concentrated in the home and the artisan workshop. For the vast majority of antebellum Americans, farmers, craftspeople, and small merchants, there was essentially no physical or conceptual distance between one's place of employment and one's place of residence, with the result that work and recreation occurred in undifferentiated space and time. Moreover, the wide array of semi-specialized skills required for subsistence, cooking, gardening, woodworking, animal husbandry, sewing, for example, allowed for no firm distinction between vocation and avocation. All this changed, certainly not overnight, but within the relatively concentrated period of Mark Twain's adult lifetime. During the decades after the Civil War, antebellum America's economic system, grounded in artisan and agrarian traditions, changed rapidly into a factory-based system, in which wage labor replaced self-employment as the norm. Jobs moved from the home to the factory, and a new workforce, made up primarily of unskilled machine operators, came to dominate industrial production. According to historian Daniel Rogers, the overall effect of factory mechanization was to change not only work relations, but the very nature of work, which became increasingly specialized, repetitious, machine-paced, and often deadeningly simple. As you might expect, these new conditions of industrial labor generated an unprecedented demand for recreation, which was increasingly viewed as a separate sphere of activity. According to historian George Kirsch, one of the principal effects of industrialization was to deprive workers of discretionary rest periods and to compel them to schedule special time for non-work activities. As recreational activities became compartmentalized into weekends, Saturday afternoons, and Sundays, they also became more fully recognizable as alternatives to work, however much emerging hobbies and recreational pastimes may actually have resembled it. As Gleason puts it, the industrial boom charged into the second half of the 19th century, tugging a recreational boom behind it. One only has to consider the staggering number of recreational activities that emerged out of nowhere and took institutional shape during the last decades of the 19th century to realize that Americans must have felt a desperate and unprecedented need both to play and to watch each other play. A partial list would include organized sports such as baseball, football, and basketball, new recreational pastimes such as bicycling, hiking, swimming, and camping, and roller skating, and progressive initiatives aimed at restoring health and character such as the urban playground movement, the national parks movement, the YMCA, and the Boy Scouts. Fueling this recreational rage was a widespread perception that Americans, whether they labored in factories or in clerical offices, were overworked and in need of better organized opportunities for leisure. To address the problem, popular advice manuals such as S. Weir Mitchell's book, Wear and Tear, or Hints for the Overworked, preached the doctrine of recreation to a readership that was just learning how to mark off separate time for leisure and to fill that time with appropriate activity. An entire literature devoted to recreational advice and instruction emerged during this period, much of it under the auspices of a nascent advertising industry, whose challenge was to align new consumer behaviors with the imperative to work less and play more. It's worth noting that the era's many recreational innovations, bicycle races, amusement parks, dance halls, urban parks, were never intended to reproduce the conflation of work and play that Mark Twain associated with the study at Quarry Farm. Precisely to the contrary, these modern recreations were set against the new experience of work in industrial culture. Americans increasingly played at appointed hours and in spaces newly conceived and set apart for leisure and recreation. Indeed, by the time Twain could write that his work at Quarry Farm was itself a form of recreation, the very idea of work that is play and play that is work had become anachronistic, a vestige of the pre-industrial past, which may be why Twain found this formulation, which he repeated many times, mildly amusing. For his contemporaries, the artisan ideal of self-regulated labor was a piece of nostalgia, like Twain's own ideal of the antebellum pilot house. So I'd like to ask you to keep the image of the pilot house and of the vigorous play that went on there in mind. It's a powerful image for Twain of pre-Civil War conditions that integrated productive labor and recreational leisure in a dynamic blend. But nostalgia for the good old times on the Mississippi is by no means the whole story about his response to the changing landscape of American work and play. In fact, in important respects, his writing falls directly in line with the era's new advice literature on the dangers of overwork and the benefits of new approaches to recreation. 2 years before Weir Mitchell published his Hints for the Overworked, Twain was explaining in The Innocents Abroad that in America we carry our business cares to bed with us, we burn up our energies with these excitements, and either die early or drop into a lean and mean old age at a time of life which they call a man's prime in Europe. Well, all of you have heard the truism, Europeans work to live, Americans live to work. Mark Twain's first book of travel meant to address that situation by taking readers, most of them for the first and only time in their lives, to a place where leisure, not work, reigns supreme. He called The Innocents Abroad a record of a pleasure trip, noting that the Quaker City's journey to Europe and the Holy Land was a novelty in the way of excursions, in that it had no other purpose than to incite pleasure. Rather than conflating work and play according to an artisan ideal, The Innocents Abroad banishes the idea of work altogether, offering modern tourism as one of those recreational innovations designed to rejuvenate and restore well-heeled but overworked Americans. Indeed, sounding much like the doctors, ministers, school administrators, and advertisers who were peddling the same advice, Twain warned that the bane of Americans is overwork. And the solution, he implied, was to take a real vacation. Not a working vacation, like the summers he would very soon begin spending in Elmira, but what the narrator of The Innocents Abroad calls a picnic on a gigantic scale. As I've already mentioned, Twain took that first working vacation in Elmira in 1871, just 2 years after publication of The Innocents Abroad had made him internationally famous. And it was during that summer's burst of creativity that Roughing It came into being. This is slightly ironic, for Roughing It is in some respects another rejection of work, another pleasure excursion, with the difference that this time the narrator travels in a stagecoach rather than a luxury steamship. Like so many overworked Americans, the narrator of Roughing It is fed up with what he calls tiresome city life, and Roughing It itself becomes the story of his escape to another land of leisure, where health and vitality are miraculously restored. At Lake Tahoe, he spends the night with an exhausted friend sleeping under the stars and wakes up the next morning thoroughly refreshed and ready to whip 10 such people as we were the day before. 3 months of Roughing It on Lake Tahoe, he says, would restore an Egyptian mummy to his pristine vigor and give him an appetite like an alligator. The narrator says he once knew a man who came west to die, but he made a failure of it. After 3 months of breathing Washoe air, he was chasing game over mountains 3,000 feet high for recreation. Roughing It scores many comic points by depicting the West as a realm of health, rest, and recreation, a playground for repentant Eastern workers. But the key difference between this book and The Innocents Abroad is that the narrator of Roughing It can never quite outrun the deadening reality of manual work. He has to earn a living, after all, and this necessity complicates the idea of a Western playground. Thus, while the atmosphere out west may have the power to revive an Egyptian mummy, a few days of mining for silver in the Sierra Mountains leave the narrator feeling hopeless and dreary, a bit like a mummy himself. He has gone west to escape the toil and exhaustion associated with industrial labor in eastern cities, but work as an hourly laborer in a quartz mill turns out to be anything but play. The narrator concludes with calculated irony that, of all the recreations in the world, screening tailings on a hot day with a long-handled shovel is the least desirable. The West may be a land of recreation and bodily restoration, but after a few weeks of blissful idleness and the nagging insistency of work, degrades recreation and leaves the narrator once again feeling exhausted and penniless. And his solution? Travel further west. This time to San Francisco, where the same pattern of idleness, followed by crushing work and exhaustion, plays out a second time. After a few weeks of scraping together a living in San Francisco, he is once again unspeakably tired and discouraged. And his solution? Travel further west, to the Sandwich Islands, modern-day Hawaii, a land of slumberous calm and solitude where, he says, things tend to emancipation from labor, turmoil, and weariness. The pattern is unmistakably clear. The narrator migrates west in search of leisure and recreation, but emancipation from labor is only temporary, and the reality of modern working conditions always catches up to necessitate another escape. The narrator takes a more philosophical view of the situation toward the end of Roughing It, when he sarcastically observes that the arrival of the sugar industry in the Sandwich Islands has begun to teach the natives what rapture it is to work all day long for 50 cents to buy food for the next day, as compared with fishing for pastime and lolling in the shade through eternal summer and eating the bounty that nobody labored to provide but nature. The natural leisure and recreation of the natives has been perverted, according to this account, by the introduction of modern employment conditions, which transform pastimes like fishing and foraging in nature into work for inadequate wages. This is the dark subplot of Mark Twain's otherwise hilarious story of Western adventure. No matter how far west the narrator goes, the system of wage labor has always arrived there first, transforming the potentially rejuvenating environment from a scene of recreation into a scene of deadening work. The idea of working for enjoyment, of taking pleasure in unregulated, non-compulsory self-employment, in short, the artisan ideal Twain associated with the pilot house and with the study at Quarry Farm, just is not a possibility in Roughing It. One either plays or one works in this book, for the predominance of industrial conditions from Missouri to Hawaii and everywhere in between has made any conflation of work and play difficult to imagine. So at this point I need a little drum roll and then a sort of a fanfare. Thank you. Perfect. It's not over. However, that prepares for the next decisive moment, which is enter Tom Sawyer, the champion of play. Twain had tried to outrun the reality of modern working conditions by migrating west in Roughing It, but the native Hawaiians had already given up fishing for pastime in exchange for a 50-cent daily wage by the time his narrator got there. Under Tom Sawyer's authority, leisure has its revenge, and labor's encroachment on the domain of play is miraculously reversed. Twain began work on the novel just 2 years after Roughing It's publication, and it is the first of his books to be composed largely in the octagonal study at Quarry Farm, which Susan Crane had constructed for her brother-in-law as a gift in 1874. I know the connection is fanciful, and I also can't prove it, but I have to suspect that idyllic setting where the work of writing could be experienced as play, inspired in Twain a new attitude toward the problem and the possibilities of work. The novel's prefatory note, which invites adult readers to remember what it was like to be a child, positions Tom's story explicitly as an exercise in nostalgia, an attempt to reclaim the childhood experience of freedom, leisure, idleness, and mischief from the clutches of an adult perspective dominated by physical work, tedious convention, and religious conformity. And Tom's succession of triumphs in the novel, as generations of readers and critics have affirmed, amounts to the triumph of play. As one prominent critic puts it, in a 19th century world that equated progress with the boiler suit and an efficiency expert's watch, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer is an extended counter-argument on behalf of liberation as play. Well, whether you've read the novel recently or not, you will likely remember that the imperative to work and the impulse to play are in constant competition in St. Petersburg, where child-rearing by adults amounts to the imposition of strict working conditions on a group of inveterate pleasure seekers. In fact, Tom and his friends are in a bind, for whereas the narrator of Roughing It can pack up and move west every time work encroaches on his freedom, Tom can only play hooky, for which he is routinely punished with more work. Aunt Polly would like to forgive him for skipping school, but she decides with characteristically self-serving logic that her duty to Tom calls for a term of captivity at hard labor. She says, "He'll play hooky this evening, and I'll just be obliged to make him work tomorrow to punish him. It's mighty hard to make him work Saturdays when all the boys is having a holiday, but he hates work more than he hates anything else, and I've got to do some of my duty by him." So Tom is condemned to whitewashing on a Saturday as punishment for taking an unauthorized holiday the day before. Compulsory, and in this case, unpaid labor has infiltrated the weekend. And Tom's monotonous task as he surveys the 90-foot-long, 9-foot-high fence has all the hallmarks of repetitive, unskilled factory work. Yet rather than grab a westbound stagecoach in the hope of outrunning this nemesis, Tom has what the narrator calls an inspiration. Nothing less than a great, magnificent inspiration. Surely you know the rest of the story. Instead of laboring at his task, Tom sets tranquilly to work. And when Ben Rogers hoves into sight, whooping and shouting commands like a riverboat pilot, Tom manages to catch his attention by appearing to take extravagant pleasure in his onerous task. Ben is incredulous at first, but Tom's artful seeming to play inspires envy, and soon Ben is begging for the chance to paint a few boards. When Tom resists, Ben offers his apple, and the first in a series of lucrative transactions is sealed to Tom's advantage. Other boys arrive and trade their worldly goods for a chance to join the fun, while the retired artist, as the narrator poignantly calls Tom, sits on a barrel in the shade. He had a nice, good, idle time all the while. The whitewashing scene is so well known that it seems almost more like a piece of mythology or a fable than a fictional episode in a relatively young writer's first novel. And perhaps for this reason, critics have tended to stay away from it. Another deterrent to interpretation is the narrator's ready-made explication, which holds that Tom had discovered a great law of human action, namely, that in order to make a man or a boy covet a thing, it is only necessary to make the thing difficult to attain. The narrator goes on with mock profundity to explain that if Tom had been a great and wise philosopher like the writer of this book, he would now have comprehended that work consists of what a body is obliged to do, and play consists of whatever a body is not obliged to do. And this would help him understand why performing on a treadmill is work, whilst rolling 9 pins or climbing Mont Blanc is only amusement. This account of Tom's magnificent inspiration, together with its elaboration by the great and wise narrator, has by and large dictated critical opinion about the whitewashing scene since the novel was published. Tom is cast as the hero, of course, and his discovery of a great law of human action, that people want what they cannot have, has allowed him to do what the narrator of Roughing It could only dream of doing: convert the experience of work into the experience of play. I say experience, for the wise philosopher's premise is that work and play are already identical, and have always been so. There's no need to convert one into the other, for climbing Mont Blanc or mining for silver can be experienced as either work or play, depending on the attitudes and circumstances of the participant. If one is being paid an hourly wage for one's efforts, the experience is suffered as work. If one pays for the privilege, the same experience is enjoyed as play. James M. Cox, perhaps Tom Sawyer's most insightful and influential champion among Twain critics, understands Tom's heroism in precisely these terms when he writes that every episode in the novel enacts the conversion of all serious community activity, all duty, pain, grief, and work into pleasure and play. Tom is the agent of this conversion because he understands that the community's serious activities, funerals, murder trials, whitewashing jobs, are already potentially available as experiences of play. All that is required to transform deadening ritual and repetitive work into riotous play is a change of attitude. Thus, to quote Cox again, Tom's play defines the world as play, and his reality lies in his commitment to play, a commitment that converts all serious projects to pleasure and at the same time subverts adult rituals by revealing that actually they are nothing but dull play to begin with. So the problem of an encroaching system of wage labor, you remember the Hawaiians? The problem of Saturdays that become whitewashing days under the despotism of adults, turns out really not to be a problem at all. For Tom Sawyer shows that it is entirely possible to convert the experience of work back into the experience of play. But is that what Tom Sawyer really does? If you pause for just a minute to re-examine Tom's commitment to play, his success in the whitewashing scene emerges in a very different light. Ben Rogers, it is worth remembering, is deeply immersed in play. In fact, he's immersed in the vigorous play of the pilot house when he hoves into Tom's sight beside that unpainted fence. Whereas Tom cleverly pretends to play at whitewashing, Ben is actually playing. He has given himself over imaginatively to the idea that he is both a riverboat pilot and his ship. As the narrator describes him, Ben was eating an apple and giving long, melodious whoops at intervals, followed by a deep-toned ding-dong-dong, ding-dong-dong, for he was impersonating a steamboat. As he drew near, he slacked speed, took the middle of the street, leaned far over to starboard, and rounded to ponderously, and with laborious pomp and circumstance. So Ben Rogers plays, and he plays laboriously. Labor and recreation are explicitly melded in his abandonment to the game of impersonating a riverboat and its pilot. Tom, meanwhile, pretends not to notice Ben's game. He fakes enjoyment at his whitewashing task, and his deception is so successful that it convinces Ben to stop playing and to begin painting. Cox and many other readers consider Tom the champion of play, but Tom's ability to make whitewashing seem like entertainment interrupts Ben's much more spontaneous recreation, his laborious play. Whether you love Tom Sawyer or hate him, as some critics do, it must be admitted that his success in the whitewashing scene brings this particular form of play to an end, not to a new beginning. And in fact, I think we can go quite a bit further and admit that Tom really does not play in any meaningful sense at all, either in the whitewashing scene or elsewhere in the novel. When his friends later abandon themselves to various literary scenarios under Tom's direction, he alone remains notably conscious that they are acting parts. In the whitewashing scene, he offers his brush to the highest bidder and then sits in the shade, perfectly idle, neither working nor playing. Tom clearly abhors hard work, like the narrator of Roughing It, but it's not quite accurate to say that he prefers play, or that his inspiration results in the triumph of play over work. For as he sits in the shade munching Ben Rogers' apple, he is conspicuously doing neither. So what is Tom Sawyer doing, we might ask? The best answer I can offer, and I don't think you're going to be terribly satisfied with it, is that he is speculating. Both in the sense that a speculator watches his investments for a chance to turn a profit without lifting a finger, and in the sense that a writer of imaginative fiction speculates, imagines, creates. Work and play, as they are represented in the novel, it should be remembered, share a crucial affinity, which is that they both lead to poverty and distress. Those who perform actual work in Tom Sawyer either receive nothing for their labor, like the slaves, or they receive a meager hourly wage, like Muff Potter and Injun Joe, who murder the young doctor after a dispute over their inadequate payment for manual labor. There is simply no reward in St. Petersburg for hard work, and Tom knows it. He also knows that those who play instead of working must pay handsomely for the privilege, like Ben and the rest of Tom's friends, who would have been completely bankrupted, according to the narrator, if the whitewash had held out a little longer. Paying for the chance to paint on Polly's fence, after all, is what makes it play rather than work. And as the wise narrator explains, the amount of enjoyment one takes in play is directly proportional to the price one pays for the experience, whether it be climbing Mont Blanc or rolling 9 pins. When Tom speculates on a depressed market to trade his trinkets for Sunday school tickets, the true cost of his friend's play hits home, and the boys are devastated to acknowledge their self-imposed poverty. Tom understands perfectly well how this economy operates to impoverish workers and players alike. And in the whitewashing scene, he manipulates the system from both ends, first attempting to exploit cheap labor by hiring Jim to paint the fence for him, then earning a small fortune by charging his friends for the right to play at the same job. Tom himself neither works nor plays. Rather, he speculates on the work and play of others. And it is precisely by refraining from work and play, by speculating so shrewdly, that Tom ascends the social and financial ladder of St. Petersburg, first through his triumph in the whitewashing scene with its economic windfall, and later when he and Huck discover a hidden treasure. On their way out of the cave after finding the valuable coins, the boys encounter a character named Mr. Jones who thinks they must be lugging a bag of old metal scrap. He comments, "The boys in this town will take more trouble and fool away more time hunting up 6 bits worth of iron to sell at the foundry when they would make twice the money at regular work." Well, of course, Mr. Jones could not possibly be more wrong. It is precisely because the boys are neither fooling away time nor engaging in regular work for meager wages that they have become rich by stumbling across Injun Joe's treasure. Under Tom's inspired guidance, the boys have really neither worked nor played, and this is the logic behind their miraculous acquisition of financial riches. They have sidestepped these unproductive and non-remunerative behaviors in order to become not prospectors like the narrator of Roughing It, but speculators. Indeed, it is intriguing to remember that they don't find the treasure by digging in the earth with shovels. They find it by speculating about where a hidden treasure ought to be. For Mark Twain, who had discovered in Nevada that toiling with a shovel is no way to get rich, this is the right way to extract precious metal from the ground. Now, if you'll allow me to conclude with one even more far-fetched claim, I would like to suggest that speculation, as a conceptual alternative to both work and play, is an apt term for what Mark Twain himself was doing for the first time in his writing career as he sat in the octagonal study composing The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, his first extended effort at what might be called speculative fiction. Twain was easily as obsessed as Tom Sawyer with achieving fame and fortune, and like Tom, he understood that one doesn't get rich by working for wages or paying to play. As a Mississippi pilot, he had briefly experienced the joys of a vocation that made nonsense of the distinctions I've spent so much time belaboring tonight. For work and play were inseparable in the pilot house, and one could earn a respectable living by practicing a trade one loved. When that trade and the artisan culture of which it was a part passed into history after the Civil War, the nature of work and play in America also changed, and it became more difficult to reconcile the two in a single image, activity, or experience. In writing Tom Sawyer here at the farm, Twain discovered that the creative labors of a serious literary artist could entail another such reconciliation. Like Tom Sawyer, though with very different consequences, as we know, he was already on his way toward becoming a speculator in the world of business. I would submit that in 1874, in the study just a few yards from here, he also learned to speculate like an artist, one whose work has become his pleasure, his recreation, his absorption, his uplifting, and all-satisfying enthusiasm. And thank you very, very much for listening. Asked me to do in terms of time, but I would love to field any kinds of questions or hear people's thoughts or criticisms. Yes?
I didn't catch all of what you had said about something about a boiler suit. What is a boiler?
That was a quote from a Twain critic talking about The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. He said, for a culture that equated progress with the boiler suit and the efficiency expert's watch. So a boiler suit would have been a protective suit that a heavy manufacturer wears in front of a massive furnace. So the most unappealing kind of industrial work.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for that critic, Tom Sawyer is the revenge of play, the triumph of play as an alternative to that idea about progress. So I don't want to now give another lecture, but I did want to just say that this talk really did come from a kind of a personal anxiety, I guess one could say, because I've always found it so odd that I get paid for what I really love to do, which is read books and think about them and talk about them with people, and it has never really quite seemed honest or fair. And it really is what got me to begin thinking about the nature of work, because I think for Mark Twain that was an important question also, and then Quarry Farm I think is the place where he experienced that wonderful feeling that one isn't working at all more than any other place. Yeah.
You said the job that Twain loved on the riverboat disappeared after the how so?
Well, so technically that's not 100% true, but the old-time riverboat pilots of the antebellum period, that industry and that particular profession really did go away. With the Civil War, of course, all commercial and passenger traffic on the river fell under military authority, so that's when Twain took off for the West. He no longer had a job piloting a steamboat in 1861. After the war, there was, of course, again, commercial and passenger traffic up and down the river, but I don't know, I mean, in his opinion, in Old Times on the Mississippi and then in Life on the Mississippi, it was no longer the same romantic profession. It was no longer the same sort of artisan.
It was work.
Yeah, it was more like, it was
Regimented.
it was a much more modern form of work. And he's very explicit about that in Life on the Mississippi, where he has more to say about work than in any other book that I'm aware of. And he laments the fact that the nature of that particular kind of work changed dramatically. Well, I know Barb has some announcements to make, but actually there's a hand in the back. Yes, did you have a question?
Was that sort of a form of chess where you would look at life differently with the styles of using time?
I missed the very first thing you said. Was that chess?
Chess,
Chess.
where you play games more seriously.
I don't know just exactly what you're asking, but that idea of playing seriously, that again is precisely what got me thinking about these questions. The idea that one can play with utter seriousness and the very fuzzy boundary that exists between what we call recreation and what we call work. I've always thought Mark Twain was incredibly insightful about that, and also that it was an important issue for him personally. Yeah.
When he wrote Huckleberry Finn, he also had Tom Sawyer playing a game when Huckleberry Finn and Jim were really in serious trouble.
Yeah.
Was Mark Twain, he latched on to Tom Sawyer as a person that throughout was always up to some kind of play.
Absolutely, and so maybe in that later novel, maybe Twain is a little more conscious of how insidious Tom's commitment to play can get. He seems less worried about that in Tom Sawyer, but I think you're absolutely right. And Huck is always the character who is trying to remind Tom that it's not really a game, both in the end and throughout. In the beginning of that novel, when Tom Sawyer is there trying to get everyone involved in the game of robbers, and then breaking up the Sunday school picnic, sort of pretending that they're involved in some sort of a military campaign. Huck is always the one trying to remind Tom and the others that it's not really a game, and there really are no elephants and no other things over there that Tom sees by enchantment. So I think this work-play dichotomy is one that Twain was always interested in, and it takes the form of a character dichotomy in Huck and Tom. Well, maybe I should just say thank you once again and let Barb come up and